Let's get your thoughts, first of all, on these latest revelations about Downing Street parties. It's not the first. I have a funny feeling it won't be the last. But yet again, rules for you and me and everyone else in this country. Kids couldn't go to school. You couldn't attend a funeral, meet one other person outdoors, not even in your own garden. Meanwhile, Prime Minister's staff organising a party originally for 100 down to 40 on the day to enjoy the lovely weather. What do you make of that party?
Well, I mean, we've seen several instances of hypocrisy along the way. But perhaps I think the most important lesson to be learned from this is that these rules didn't really make a lot of sense in the first place. So, of course, there is the hypocrisy itself is really,
I mean,
it's really quite galling.
This is the irony, isn't it? Is that no one died as a result of these young, healthy people meeting up. And that's why, young, healthy people could have carried on meeting up during this period if they'd taken reasonable precautions.
In other words, it wasn't that they were doing something wrong in carrying on having this party. It was that they were telling other people not to.
Yeah.
So that's where the sort of irony, as you say.
Exactly.
Lies.
Well, what's interesting about where we are right now, of course, is the Prime Minister has resisted urges to keep us in lockdown last July, to put us in lockdown in the autumn and ahead of Christmas. Right now, we've got restrictions in Plan B due to end on the 26th of January. Emergency legislation due to end in March. There's a strong hope and possibility that we will not be going into more restrictions, certainly this time round. I'd like to give credit where credit's due to the government on this one, but these actions have provided the proof, as we see massive restrictions across Europe and many restrictions around the UK and other countries around the UK, that we never needed these restrictions to get through any of the waves of COVID, did we?
No, I don't think so. We had some uncertainty, of course, in March 2020 about what they would do. And that's something we did have some uncertainty about, which now, thanks to these sort of observational studies that have inadvertently been set up, we can say now with confidence that they don't really work. The other bit of evidence in this regard is the failure of the models, the SAGE models and the others, which invoke NPIs as the primary driving force.
That's non-pharmaceutical interventions.
That's right. Yeah. So those models, the fundamental assumption is that what we were seeing was a result of those restrictions having a major effect. And the thing to learn from their failure to predict what would happen when those restrictions were lifted is that those restrictions were not doing that job. So I think a lot of people are keen to, again, just sort of mock those who make wrong predictions. But in fact, in this case, what we should do is models are there to learn from. Yeah. So if they fail, they show something. And what these models, the failure of these models shows is that those restrictions were not necessary.
Well, indeed, members of SAGE have now admitted that their models for what would happen if we didn't have restrictions in England with Omicron, they've admitted, yes, those models, they're going back to the drawing board. But of course, the models throughout have always been far more doom-mongering. Their worst case scenarios, their best case scenarios, always, just far in excess of what we have actually seen. And yet, modelling has again and again been used to justify restrictions on our lives, and I think will be used again later this year. If we get another Omicron wave, as many are predicting, if we get another wave, as many expect next winter, that we are another variant, we are going to be facing the same battles. And yet,
well, I'd just like to say one thing in defence of modelling. It's very easy to explain what's happened using a model that doesn't make this assumption that the restrictions were having a strong effect. But you can explain what's happened almost anywhere in the world with a model that assumes that herd immunity is doing the heavy lifting and that seasonality plays an important role.
Okay. Now, various reports lately have been sort of backing up what you and other signatories of the Great Barrington Declaration always stated. Things like T cells from common colds, it's believed, according to a new Imperial College study, could protect against coronavirus infection. This is something that many leading epidemiologists had been saying and were dismissed as cranks. And yet, what a surprise. The evidence is looking pretty strong on this. And indeed, that natural immunity can provide some of the greatest resistance to this virus as well.
Indeed, we have been saying for a very long time that we need to consider the trajectory of the SARS-CoV-2 in the context of other coronaviruses, its sort of wider ecology, as it were. And one of the things we fail to recognize, not just for coronavirus, but other diseases like flu, is the extent to which exposure to related viruses give you protection both against disease, and it turns out with the coronavirus against infection. But when we tried to publish a paper on this in sort of July 2020, all the top journals said this was not of sufficient general interest. So there you go.
Yeah, quite bizarre. And in terms of where we are in terms of policy right now, not just in the UK, I mean, in Wales and Scotland, and different treatment of the unvaccinated. Indeed, even in England, you still have to isolate if you've got been in contact with somebody, if you're unvaccinated, but not if you're vaccinated. Different rules, certainly extraordinary different rules for people living in Europe, many of the countries where we've got extremely authoritarian rules for the unvaccinated, while the vaccinated are allowed to live fairly freely. What do you make of this pointing the finger at those, I think it's 5 million people in this country who remain unvaccinated, many for very different reasons, and blaming them for the continuation of the pandemic and the threat of restrictions? What do you make of that?
Well, it's utterly illogical because, of course, as we know, the vaccines are only they're fantastic at preventing severe disease and death, it would seem, but they have a very transient ability to protect you against infection or to stop you from passing it on. And that's not surprising because natural infection also is good at giving lifelong protection against severe disease, but does not give you long-lasting infection-blocking immunity. So, I mean, unless you see it within that sort of context, none of what we've observed about coronavirus makes sense. And in that context, it's absolutely, as I said, just illogical to discriminate against people who have not been vaccinated on that basis. Now, obviously, people who are vulnerable should go ahead and get vaccinated because that gives you individual protection against disease. But you cannot use vaccines as a tool to control transmission. So we're going to have to rely on herd immunity to achieve that. And that is most reliably, most sustainably achieved through natural infection.
And again, the phrase herd immunity has now been ascribed with sort of almost sort of evil connotations, when this is how all diseases are dealt with ultimately, whether it's via vaccine or natural infection or a combination of the two. In terms of where we are in terms of the demands for cutting down on isolation time, calls for an end to mass testing, particularly of healthy people, particularly healthy young people who aren't at risk, and the changes that people are talking about there. And we've had Clive Dix, the former head of the UK vaccine task force, saying we should end the focus on mass vaccination. We can't jab everybody every few months, but focusing on the vulnerable. Do you think that inevitably the world eventually is going to be dragged kicking and screaming to the position of the Great Barrington Declaration, which is that we should have dealt with this pandemic the same way we had to plan to deal with all pandemics, which is you care for the elderly and the vulnerable, those most at risk, you give advice, and otherwise you let people go about their daily lives? Do you think that you're going to be vindicated in the end?
I don't like putting it like that, and it's sort of embarrassing to think of, ourselves as winners in this. And of course, the Great Barrington Declaration was simply one of many efforts to put all those ideas that you've just so beautifully articulated, to bring those to the table for discussion. And it is gratifying to see that they are now being acknowledged as, I mean, these are all well-established principles that as you just said, but what is astonishing is that we were all vilified and made to feel like we were proposing something highly unethical, when we said that this was probably the only way forwards and the only way to actually save lives.
Indeed. Well, we shall wait and see. Time will tell who was on the right side of history or not. Professor Sunetra Gupta, always so good to talk to you.